Great. Um, Dear friends, welcome to you all to the webinar, Exploring Interlinkages, Women, Peace and Security, Militarism and Masculinities, the virtual roundtable webinar. So this webinar is organized by Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, WILPF in short, and Meaning is Alliance. We are excited to know that 66 people have registered for the webinar, and few are still joining in. And would like to thank you all for making your time to join us today. So we look forward to hearing from our amazing panelists today, who you will be knowing shortly, and jointly engage in critical discussions and reflections on the current state of field of work towards the realization of women, peace, and security agenda, including through the lens of transforming masculinities vis-a-vis our common agenda to dismantle patriarchy, which is also the objective of this webinar today. So we'd like to take this opportunity to acknowledge the presence of members and partners across various regions, Africa, Asia, and the Pacific, including Australia, Caribbean, Europe, Middle East, and North America, who we have with us here in the webinar today. So before we begin, I'd like to just put out some points with regards to the logistic and technical matters so that we know what will happen and how we will flow throughout the webinar. We kindly request all the panelists and facilitators to unmute yourself and keep your cameras on so that we can see each other and the participants can see as well. And we kindly request all the facilitators also to stay on. And also for the participants, you all will be muted automatically by the system when you logged in. And please feel free to use chat box, which is on the last list in the, if you look at the screen, it's the last called chat in your screen for any questions, comments, or any technical issues that you face in joining. After the panelists share their presentations, we'll have some time for your contributions as well, and the facilitators will let you know when that time comes and unmute you for that. And for that, please, we'd encourage you to use, there is a hand button on it after your name, which is what you need to click on if you want to say anything or come in. There's an alarm going on. Thank you. And then if you face any technical difficulties with any audio issues, please do let us know through chat as well. This is a safe space for critical reflections, and we always maintain Chatham rules for any of the webinars or seminars we organize and meetings we organize, and this is the same case for today as well. And this means participants are free to use the information received, the knowledge that will be discussed, but neither the identity nor the affiliation of the speakers nor that of any participants may be used without any further consent in any other forums. We'd like to inform you that we will be recording this as well. So if any one of you have any reservations to this recording, this is time to let us know about that as well. So thank you all for your patience once again. Now I'd like to hand it over to Madeline and Yoni for the next step.
Hi everyone, good day, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thank you all so much for joining. I'm going to just ask my fellow panelists for a moment. Are you able to hear us okay?
Yes.
Okay,
yes,
great. I guess this is quite an experiment for all of us in this world where as activists we're working together, but also in being in very different places. And we're quite excited to be using a virtual platform to organize a meeting like this, but it's also quite a new thing for all of us to do that. So please bear with us as we are trying to figure out how everything works. Once again, thanks so much for being here. My name is Yoni van Zandt. I work with the Global Secretariat of Men Engaged Alliance together with Lakshman and of course many others. And we're very excited to be able to organize this webinar together with WILPF, who we are incredibly fortunate to have on our global board. And we have, for a couple of years now, been building a partnership with WILPF. And why this is so exciting for us is Because what we've observed, I think, over the last few years is that there's a lot of interest in masculinities and in engaging men and boys, and kind of the roles of men when it comes to violence, conflict, increasing rise of fundamentalisms. And this is an expertise that Men Engage Alliance brings in. But we also have still a lot of questions around what actually those links are between masculinities and peace and security. And then at the same time, we have WILPF and WILPF members and partners who have decades of experience, over a century of experience, in fact, on women, peace, and security, and supporting women activists and peace builders to understand gender and security. And I think that we see connections between the kind of work that we're doing, but we also, I think, still have questions around where are the interlinkages between the women, peace, and security agenda, the roles of men and boys, what can be the roles that men and boys can play in supporting the women, peace, and security agenda, but also more broadly, what is the partnership and what is the work that we can do together to be peace builders and to counter patriarchy in all its manifestations. And we really see the partnership with WILPF as very valuable to try and figure this out together. Not saying that we're having the answers, but to really create spaces where we can come together, share our experiences, share our concerns, brainstorm, and come up with collective actions. And I think those are also really the purposes of this platform. So welcome, thank you for joining us. I want to reiterate the point that we really want to have this as an interactive conversation, to the extent that that's of course possible on a virtual platform. So we will have panelists and they will share some of their perspectives, and then we really welcome all the participants to share your questions in the questions comment box. And there will be a part of the conversation where us as facilitators will be taking your questions out and we'll be posing them to the panelists and facilitate an interactive conversation like that. But first, we will hear from the panelists, and this part will be facilitated by Madeline Rees. We're very, very happy to have you on the conversation with us. Please take it away.
No, thanks, Jenny. Where else will I be on a day when we're going to have a conversation about masculinities, militarism, and peace and security? Just to echo, really welcome everybody to the webinar. I hope this is going to be more than interesting, because I think what Yoni set out in terms of the partnership that we are to establish between WILPF and the Men Engage Alliance is, I think it's new. A couple of years is nothing in terms of our history. But it's also revolutionary, because I think for the first time we have what are essentially two movements that we are trying to build together as one. And I think the real crucial question is how we move on from looking at how men engage and how women work into one is how are we together going to dismantle patriarchy? How can we build a sort of trust, the understanding of how power works, so that we can really, really, I think, tear apart the structures which hold patriarchy together and which create the militarism and the masculinities which support militarism, and how then we work that into the women, peace and security agenda, which is not just a women, peace and security agenda, it's a peace and security agenda. So I think no one said it's going to be easy. We all have our default positions, and I, like so many of the hard-bitten feminists amongst us, do end up tearing my hair out on occasion, because I forget that in fact we have to look at patriarchal violence, not just look at men and blame them for everything. We also have to see the role that women are coerced into playing within that patriarchal system as well. So it's not black and white, it's not simple, it's not straightforward, it's complicated, and it requires all of us to fundamentally rethink how we've been brought up, because none of us have been brought up to think of it in the terms that we are now trying to shift and reframe the entire discourse on power structures, culture, and patriarchy. So this is just one of those big discussions, I think, as to how we are going to take this forward. And so what we want to do in the course of this webinar, I'm going to hand it over to Cynthia Enlow in a moment, Most of you, anyone who's been in WILPF for a long time, will know the work of Cynthia Enloe, because she is one of the foremost feminist thinkers on militarism, masculinity, famous author, all-round fabulous person. Don't know what we're going to do if we ever retire, which you're not allowed. But we've asked her if she would frame the discussion to give us a big overview of what we're actually talking about. And then what we'll do is we'll move to some of the men who have been really trying to make this work on the ground, to bring their personal experience within the context, different contexts within which they're working. We're hoping we're going to be joined by Anand Pawar from India. He's working with the Men Engage Alliance in India, but at the moment is stuck on his way to the office. We hope he's going to arrive in time to be on the panel. If not, we'll try and bring him in later. We do, as you can see, we have already Elad Mutandu from DRC, who's with the Men Engage Alliance there, in a very, very difficult context, trying to work on women, peace and security. So we really want to hear from him on the context in which he's working. And also missing at the moment, but we hope we're going to be able to get through the wonders of modern technology, is Guy Fougat, who is from Cameroon, and he works with WILPF on the disarmament and communications elements. So, Cynthia, without more ado, can I hand it over to you to frame the discussion?
Yes, that's quite a challenge, but first of all, just want to say hi to everybody who's listening, and just what an honor it is to be working with Elad and Anand and Guy, as well as Madeline and Yoni and Laxman. So this is already a wonderful opportunity, and I'm looking forward to everybody's questions. When Yoni and Laxman and Madeline and all began to think about what I might offer, I thought maybe I could just remind us all that, in fact, feminists playing all kinds of roles have been very interested in, curious about, yes, frustrated by certain forms of masculinity and how they get formed, and particularly how certain sorts of what I would call distorted masculinities are absolutely relied upon by militarists. And what I mean by that is that we've discovered over decades of looking into this, and many of the listeners are part of those explorations, we've learned that you cannot militarize a society unless you can distort masculinity. And you can't, now this is the feminist insight, you can't distort masculinity, that is, militarize it, create a kind of masculinity that is useful to militarists. You can't do that unless you can make men and boys afraid of femininity. Unless men and boys can be taught to fear being called feminine or being seen as feminine, you cannot militarize them. So it means that femininity has always been part of understanding masculinity. A healthy, and Elad can talk a lot more about this from his own direct experience working with men and boys in Congo. But men and boys, usually from an early age, are taught not to be like girls, not to be like women. And in fact, one of the classic insults, intimidations that drill sergeants in many militaries around the world use to make young men who are becoming soldiers shape up and act like, quote, proper soldiers, is to yell woman at them, as if that will make a young man dissolve in fear, because to be called a woman is the worst thing in the world for many boys and men. So it means that unless one's really curious about the workings of femininities, one really can't understand the workings of masculinities, because it's the presumed inferiority of anything feminine that makes men and boys, and those who teach them, which include women as mothers and aunts and sometimes even drill sergeants, use the fear of femininity to create soldiers. This means that feminists and people working on masculinities, both healthy masculinities and distorted, warped masculinities, which I think are most militarized masculinities, have to be really curious about the relationships between women and men, between girls and boys, and what is taught that so shoehorns men and boys into a distorted notion of masculinity that they're able to be turned into militarizers. So I think the work that feminists have been doing for years, both as activists and as explorers in all kinds of roles, are absolutely crucial. You have to be able to understand the relationships between women and men in order to understand masculinity, because it's warping relationships between women and men, putting them in a hierarchical, unequal relationship, putting them in a relationship of fear and intimidation that militarizers depend on. So I'm very pleased to be part of this conversation. I'm very pleased to see this developing relationship between WILPF that does its important feminist work globally, and Men Engage, which is doing its local and global work in such important ways. I'm really glad that we're having this conversation. I think it's crucial. I don't think one can do a genuine exploration of how boys and men have their own notions of boyhood and manhood militarized unless one is genuinely curious about the lives of women and girls. That to me is crucial. It's impossible to really take seriously the workings of masculinity unless one's really genuinely interested in the experiences and ideas of girls and women. That's, to me, a grounding understanding to work on militarism and thus to dismantle it.
Thank you, Cynthia. That was fabulous. For those of you who don't know the work of Cynthia, I think one of her signature phrases is this feminist curiosity and the need to shine the feminist spotlight in order to better understand the workings of militarism and masculinities in particular, which means addressing what feminism is and femininity is. Anand, you made it.
Yeah.
Well done. Anand Pawar from Samyak, I introduced you before in your absence when you were trying to get into the office to get to some sort of technical device. We've got questions for you really to pick up on what Cynthia was saying. I don't know whether you caught it all from the beginning, but we want to know really why you, as Anand Pawar, working on men and masculinities, and how are you doing this in the particular context of India, which is a lot about nationalism, a lot about military suppression, and if you could speak something to the Women Peacemakers program activist trainings and whether and how they were influential on you.
Yeah, thank you so much. Hi everyone. I'm very happy to be part of this discussion, and which is very crucial. And I'm very happy that Men Engage is, in a way, politicizing its work. By bringing in issues around militarism, etc. I also want to acknowledge the contributions of Women Peacemaker program in the Netherlands, with whom I've been part of the training programs, and then which really helped me expand my understanding of violence, because my context in India is communal violence and not the war, in a way, and especially in the state where I live in is a safer state, state like Maharashtra. So I come from a city called Pune. So it's a very safe city. There are hardly any gun conflicts or those kind of. And this Women Peacemaker program trainings really helped me to expand my understanding, go beyond the boundaries, and or talk about kind of cross-border tensions and cross-border whatever. And I decided to work. It was my personal journey basically to start working with men. It was also because I was dealing with, or I was trying to deal with my own violent behaviors, where I started talking to my friends in India and South Asia, who really helped me to come out of that cycle of violence that I used to commit, and I really thought that it is going to be very important to work on this, And then not just talk about these gender sensitive men, as in those who are just getting into kitchen, but to basically politicize it from feminist perspective. And when I say that, to politicize it from feminist perspective, I do believe that South Asia has this rather, I would say, very strong presence of feminist movement in South Asia, which has been working on peace building in a different sense. For instance, women standing on the borders of Pakistan and India and talking about peace, happened in India. So there is a lot to learn from women's movements, and I'm using it in plurals, and different kind of feminisms in a way. For instance, India has got a very strong presence of Dalit feminism. And Dalit, if you understand the category, Dalit is in a kind of lower caste, so-called lower caste kind of categories. And I think there is a whole lot of lessons to learn from all different sects within women's movement and within feminist movement in South Asia. I also thought that we need to really challenge the histories of militarism. It's not just about the militarism at the time, but South Asia has been, for some geopolitical reason, has been a kind of terrain where there always was a celebration of militarization in different sense, not just across the borders but also within the borders. For instance, states like Bihar in India would really celebrate, during their wedding programs, they'll just fire the arms and, just to celebrate that. So there is a whole lot of celebration of violence. There are histories of violence, and, if you talk about that, and if we want to really talk about men's relationship with this kind of violence, it also comes through the histories of the region. It is not just about the one single man and his relation with violence, but it comes with the histories of violence, where if you allow me another few minutes, I want to narrate something. For instance, there was this engineering program happening in Maharashtra, which was like a lap tacking program. Lap tacking is like, where you do hydropower generation. Okay. And many people were like, watching that hydropower initiation. And then there was this huge blast within this water wire. And everyone started shouting Shivaji Maharaj ki jai. Now, Shivaji Maharaj was a warrior, caste and warrior king. 450 years back. You still need a figure to celebrate all kind of victories of this time and all kind of violent imageries. So one really need to really see it's not just about violence in a man doing some kind of violence. It's about the culture of violence that has been historically there. That has been historical there. And as you correctly said, I also want to bring in 2 points here, and I'm sure I hope my state doesn't really trouble me for that. There are a whole lot of state initiated violence through male, I would say, through men in uniforms under the name of development. So market-led, state-led violence is something that we need to also worry about. And yes, nationalism, for that matter, because we recently, a couple of years back, we celebrated this victory over Pakistan. I don't know what, I was also talking to friends in Pakistan saying, we are celebrating victory over Pakistan on our televisions, and our prime minister is doing this and that, and our friends in Pakistan said we are also celebrating the victory of violence, of the war. So see, there are common histories of violence, there are common histories of nationalism, there are common histories of militarization in South Asia. And I think I'm really worried about the way men relate with these histories, and not just about the way they relate with the kind of this time kind of violence. They are linked with violence in South Asia since few centuries, I guess. And I'll stop here.
No, thanks, Alan. I think that was an extremely pertinent intervention, because we eschew history at our peril, really, because that's where we are learning from, that's where we take our guidance from, and how the question has got to be, how do we make the break from what has been a history of nationalism, instrumentalizing militarism in order to pursue the sorts of goals which religious determinism needs, and how does that impact on ordinary men, which is what we're really talking about in this sort of context. We need to move on, but I'm not sure if we haven't got Guy, no? Guy hasn't been able to get in from Cameroon?
I don't see him here.
No, I don't see him either. So Ilot, can we move to you and to the DRC, where you are currently working as the, working on with Men Engaged as the DRC coordinator. Could you speak a little bit again about how your personal involvement, why it was you became engaged, and then how is it to work on issues of masculinities in DRC, which is essentially still very much in conflict?
Thank you very much, Madeline, for giving me the floor. And I think that I'm from the same group as Anand, and let's say that we benefited a lot from the Women Peacemakers program training that really revealed us how violence is affecting everyone among us, but mostly women and children in conflict areas. Let's say that I'm really happy to be part of this of these talks, because then I'll have to share my experience working in conflict, the most conflict affected area, where people are dying every day and no one is thinking about it. And let's say that I have to confess that my activism was really inspired by my mother. Since my father was a polygam, he was having like many wives, and he was obliged to leave us at early age. And I really saw how my mother struggled to raise 5, 6 kids with no job, with nothing, and the whole, let's say, the education that she was providing to us was like, please be non-violent in your life, because violence is not a solution. So then when I attended the WPP training in The Hague, in the Netherlands, so it was an opportunity for me to rethink, how do I behave, how do I face violence in general. And as you may know, that I was born in conflict affected area, where violence is like our daily life. And that leadership from my mother and the conflict context in which I was living in, where I was at some point obliged maybe to join armed groups, because most of the people I grew up with are now high-ranked officers in the army, and others are at the other side in armed groups, rebel groups, and so forth. And at that moment, I was just asking myself where is my place? Do I have to go to the National Army, or join those armed groups, rebel groups that are fighting day and night with no motivation? And I with the help of my mother and that I had time to know how I can engage other men in this struggle, especially when it comes to women's and men partnership in peace building, and also how dealing with security matters. So, you know, we are in a society that has many problems related to security, and unfortunately, issues related to security are only dealt by men, but issues related to peace, women are taking part in mobilizing the community, in sensitizing the community, while men are only sitting in the peace talks, getting money from the government, but not talking about peace. They are only talking about political agendas. How do I reinforce the power and dominance, and so forth? So today there is a need, really. There is a need, and we are already working on it in DRC, that we need to come together, men and women, to work for peace and non-violence. I remember that I met the MONUSCO, which is the the UN mission in DRC, the MONUSCO force commander, and we were discussing about women's participation in DRC. And he told me, he gave me only one small sentence that inspired me a lot. When I was telling him about all these issues related to women's exclusion, he told me, please, as men, we need to give space to women. We don't need to negotiate it. It's a right for them to be given space. And I think that I kept that sentence up to know that, yes, in whatever we are doing in peacemaking, peace building, and security achievement, we need to give space. Let's say qualitative space, quantitative space to women in order to build a peaceable society in DRC. So that is what I've learned from, let's say, after 10 years working on this context, which is, I think, the most violent in the world. Thank you.
No, thank you. That's quite inspirational, to say the least. Can I just ask a quick follow-up question? Because both you and Ananda have referenced the Women Peace Builders program. What was it in that program that really brought home to you the need to work differently, to not go off and join the armed militias or to join the government forces?
Yeah, Ilo, you want to come on that?
No, please go on.
Yeah.
Okay, well, let's start.
What I basically think is that the pedagogy of the entire training program was absolutely non-masculine. Okay, if I could say, it was what I liked is basically the content, the way it was planned, and the pedagogy was a feminist pedagogy, which really helped people to reflect on your personal positions around violence. It was not about theorizing violence. It was not about theorizing women, peace, security in 1325, 1820. It was more of, providing space to the participants to reflect on their own positions about violence and finding how they are, in a way, committing violence or are exposed to violence. I remember, your sister-in-law was killed when you were in Netherlands, right, in the DRC. I remember that sad news, that time. So it was not very, so, we, and it remained as a very informal group, it didn't really remain as a kind of, so the Together for Transformation was the call that we sent out to the world, was basically informed by a feminist understanding of peace, because we always said that market also want peace because they cannot sell their beauty products in a kind of conflict situations, right? And we learned this feminist politics about peace in WPP's training program, because and I always say that the meaning of the word peace changes from which dictionary it is coming from, right? If it is coming from UN dictionary, its meaning is different. If it's coming in from market industry, its meaning is different. If it's coming from feminist understanding, the meaning is different. If it is coming from men's, if at all, if there is movement, it is different. So what I thought is that WPP program taught us, I would say taught us, the feminist politics of the term peace and security.
That's great. Ilot, can I ask you a follow-up question on cheating here? Because Guy unfortunately can't get online, so we've got a few extra minutes than we thought, so I can cheat and take more time. But I'd like to know, following up from that, if the training gave you the tools as to understanding what the difference, what real peace should be and how to look at it from a feminist perspective, how did your male contemporaries react to you when you were the one not going into the military, eschewing the mentality which said to be a man you've got to fight, but you actually embraced this alternative view of what security meant?
Yes, I think it's it's quite common in DRC, in Congo, when you try to raise these questions or talking about peace, non-violence, gender equality, and so forth, that people are saying, this guy is from Europe, he spent there like 1 month and he's bringing those Western ideas to us, to impose those ideas. But it was like, those were the first impressions of people I met after the training. But what was positive in the training, I think, was, I think that is so common to many men I'm meeting now in DRC, that we are suffering because of ignorance. We are suffering because people are trying to tell us that gender equality is a problem for us. You know, people are telling us that women's empowerment is a threat to men. And I had quite the same ideas before going to the training. And as Anand was saying, that we had time now to reflect on that, to discuss and learn and see what are the advantages and disadvantages of gender equality, for instance, and how nonviolence can help to promote gender equalities. But also we reflected on nonviolence principles in active nonviolence. And you know, we tried to reflect on Gandhi's reflections and phrases and so forth. And we were reflecting on our own lives, not talking about others. And that, I think, that was the most important thing that I got from the Netherlands, that the problem is not others, the problem is me, and I have to be the solution to those problems. In case
You know, lost your audio.
We lost a crucial moment. No, we're losing it.
You know, you're playing some music. What?
In DRC, in Congo context, are really ignoring. Can you hear me?
We lost you for some time, but you're
not.
Are you back, Ilot? Can we hear you now?
Yes.
Yes, you're back.
Okay, thank you. I'm sorry. So I was saying that many needs really enough information related to
no,
you're losing you again.
You're breaking up, Ilot. We really can't catch what you're saying. Could I just go?
Sounds like you're playing guitar.
To gender equality and so forth. So what we have also seen in the countries that
he's gone completely. So sorry for that. It's let's hope he can rejoin. Have we lost him completely?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we have. But I mean, we're getting a gist of it, which is essentially it was about knowing his place in the role he as a person had to play, rather than going along with the pack mentality. Is that similar for you then, Anand? Did you catch that, Anand?
No, I'm sorry. Come again.
Oh no,
I lost your audio.
I wondered if he were. We keep going. It's this African bit. We keep losing ourselves. Oh, you're back. Ilot, you're back. I was just going to ask Anand if he'd had a similar experience in terms of, you know, having it needing to be from the individual to make the changes so as not to go and be part of this identity, this masculine identity is created by, in his context, nationalism and religious belief. But if we could just finish your point that you were making while we've still got you about gender equality.
Ilot?
Yes. Okay, I was just saying that we need more men to be informed about gender equality, to be aware of gender equality, its benefits and so forth. So yes, and trying to put a link between the two, we need to mostly explore the individual level of engaging in gender equality promotion and also peace building. Because my experience here is that when you go to a village and you invite men to discuss with them about these issues, what they will tell you, please go to the other village. There they have many problems. They are telling you like that, like they don't have their own problems in the community. But when you look like a participatory analysis and reflections, then
We've lost you again a lot. I think you were just talking about the politics of displacement. It's not my problem, it's somebody else's problem. Go sort that lot out, because I'm fine. Thank you very much. Yeah. Can I just quickly move to Cynthia? Oh, just to get your reflections on what's been said, so we can then move on perhaps to Yoni, and you can go into interrogations which are coming from the participants in the webinar, so what they want to put to the participants on the panel. Cynthia.
Anand and Ilat, I've been so interested in your observations, but also in your experiences and how reflective you are about it's just so important, isn't it, for all of us to sort of note and kind of make a mark someplace about when we learn something new, right? And when we see ourselves freshly in a way that we don't ever remember seeing ourselves before. And I think one of the great advantages, one of the great pluses of engaging, just as you both have done, in feminist processes is that you find yourself radically, and I use the word radical to mean root. You go to the root of what peace really can be and what's sustainable peace that can be perpetuated over weeks and months and from generation to generation, what that kind of peace requires from each of us, but from all of us working together. And the second thought that I was struck by is how you each, by engaging with feminist processes and feminist activists, have rethought what it takes to build security, real security, not fake, narrow security by the gun, but rather a security that is built on mutual respect, mutual dignity, listening to each other, and working together, women and men, and in men and women. And that both you're rethinking and you're re-engaging with new ideas of peace and new ideas of security seems so deeply feminist to me. And I think it's one of the things that all of us I wasn't born a feminist, you know, I bet even Madeline wasn't born a feminist. This is hard to believe, but I think it's possible. And
I was related too, then.
But one of the things that I remember as I became a feminist is I had to move between the most intimate scales of my life. That is how I imagined myself, how I imagined my mother, how I imagined my friendships, how I imagined this thing called a career, always in quotes, to how did I relate to militarism? How did I relate to this false notion of patriotism? I'm very skeptical of patriotism. How I related to nationalism, how I related to state definitions of enemies and state definitions of threats, that I had to move between how I thought about my mother to how I imagined genuine security. And I had to go back and forth between those two in order to develop as a feminist. And I think it's one of the things that makes, just as Anand and Ilat have given us such a good sense of, it makes it so exciting. I mean, it makes you nervous, you know, It is kind of shocking and a little embarrassing at various points, but it's also so thrilling. And peace, of course, peace is thrilling.
I think it's a brilliant way to round off this first panel session, because clearly it is exciting. As we said at the very beginning, it's a bit revolutionary because we've not done this before, but look at the ways in which we can start pushing an agenda which is very different from the one that has gone before, even though envisaged, I think, by WILPF 103 years ago. And just to say, isn't it tragic that the Women Peace Builders program has had to close? I mean, look what it's done in terms of the incredible work that it's done on the ground. So if any of you out there are listening, then, you did a fantastic job, people, and we will carry it forward together. Anand, you want to say something?
Yeah. On Women Peacemaker program, what I think is that we as activists need to really reflect on this. It was very sad when when the board decided to stop in a way. Also shows the way funding is being channelized, whether the smaller women's groups are going to be on the agenda or not. So to me, it was not just about a sad news that WPP stopped. For me, that's the politics. I mean, and I don't know what to do with that. I'm a very small guy. I mean, sitting somewhere in Pune in India. But I seriously feel that we need to really reflect around smaller women's groups, taking up something like this. And I really wanted to use this opportunity to, express solidarity with that kind of uh, that kind of closure.
Yeah, I think many of us will.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yoni, can I turn it over to now my co-host and facilitator?
Absolutely. Thank you. And I just want to quickly reiterate the point that Anand has made on how important it is that we also talk about solidarity and support for the women's rights led groups and women's leadership when we're talking about engaging men and transforming masculinities. And I think there are some questions actually in the chat box around how do we respond as a community of practice to economic pressures and the links between militarism and I think what Will always refers to as the the economic pressures that are coming basically out of the military system and that in some way are affecting us as well as civil society, the resources that we have available. But I would like to pause that for a moment. I first really want to reiterate the point to all the participants that we have a chat box where we would love to see your comments and questions on the conversation. And there's two places to do that. There is the questions box and there's the chat box. You can use both of them. We have people moderating the questions and comments that are coming out there. And it's incredibly important that those who are participating in the conversation get a chance to interact with the people who are on the panel, so that it's not just the facilitators asking questions, but really those who are in the broader group. So moving on then to the next section, I think what also struck me, and Cynthia, you already summarized that too, is the level of kind of personal reflection that both Anand and Elot shared. And I know that he also has similar experiences. Unfortunately, he's not part of the conversation now. But I think what happens as women is that we grow up basically having a sense of genderedness, maybe not deliberately until we're actually become familiar with the concept of gender, but this experience of being a woman and reflecting on that and what does that mean, and what does that mean for your security, and what does that mean for your opportunities in life is something that as women we experience from a very early age. And I think that what we were talking about now is that by engaging men and working with men to also see that, their own genderedness and their own experiences, that level of personal reflection is a very powerful tool, basically making it click with men for them to be part of activism, of feminist activism. And I think that's something that we see across Men Engaged Alliance by many of the members, that's an entry point, and that happens in many contexts, creating those kind of spaces for men together with women to talk about these issues and making it personal. And that leads me actually to a question that I would like to ask both Ilot and Anand, and that is, you've reflected a lot on the personal, but then what did you go and do with that once it clicked with you? What are some of the activities that you have done in your own context to taking it forward and making it click with other men? So basically to share a little bit more concretely about your own work, because I think in the end this personal clicking is very important, but the challenges we are facing is about systemic transformation, and that's really big. So how do we make that next step from the personal to basically creating an oil stain of more and more people and more men also becoming involved in this? And I know you've both really worked on that. So maybe then starting with you, Ilot, could you share a little bit about your kind of more concrete work in DRC?
Okay.
Thank you very much for the question. From my personal reflection, I really had many changes first of all in my family, because that was one of the recommendations and advices we got from facilitators, fellow brothers and sisters. We were together in the Netherlands during the training. So in my family, I did many things that I can not
Ilot, we lost you again. There's been a recommendation maybe for you to switch off your video, which we would most likely be able to get more of the streaming for your voice.
Great shot.
Okay. Yes, I hear that there were actually a lot of questions about my voice also not being clear. But just to summarize, my question to the panelists moving forward is, once we have made that personal connection, and in this case, this was shared by Ilot and Anand, and once it has clicked that gender is something personal, and this kind of feminist activism or feminist curiosity has become a seed in your own life, what then have you done with that at a more professional activist level to take it forward and work with other men and other people in your communities, in your societies, to address kind of the broader issues in our societies? And Anand, while we wait for Ilot, it would be great to hear from you on this.
Yes. Thank you, Yoni. See, largely my interventions with communities and with men and boys are through workshops where we take them through a lot of reflection process and continue engaging with them through campaigns. So it's not just about doing a workshop of 2 days and leaving people around, but basically connecting with them at a very personal level, and inviting them to be part of the journey of equity. So not just do a workshop and leave it there as a kind of tick mark activity, but to engage with them. Now we professionally, the modules that we deliver to men are basically tailored, because you need to really identify the institutional spaces where men have positions. Men have positions. For instance, in my context, in my country context, cooperatives, agriculture, politics, sugarcane industry, those are the institutions which are being really captured in a way, really captured by men. So basically talk to these men, also with political parties. I do intervene with political parties which are left-leaned, more of a progressive kind of stuff. So institutional interventions are required, not individual men. Secondly, what we follow as in Samyak, for a decade now, as an organization, we try to reach, I give them a kind of name, difficult to reach kind of men. So difficult to reach men. For instance, urban slum, village men are easily accessible to development agencies. You just go and you just pick them and you do whatever kind of preaching and whatever. But those who are setting the standards of masculinity are not within your control, are not, because they are the one who are like setting up the standards of masculinity, you know, for other guys. So working with difficult to reach men, you know, for instance, you know, just a quick example. For instance, you know, we do not work with young men who are part of national service scheme. There is something called NSS in India, okay, national service scheme. They are already kind of converted kind of guys, okay. Many organizations are very happy working with them. We necessarily work with them who are hanging around canteens, who are hanging around parking lots, who are part of the problem, who are part of the kind of sexual harassment. Try and catch them, you know, and try and talk to them. I think, you know, that is going to be important, because those are difficult to reach, and NGOs for that instance, you know, develop their indicators in a very non-political way, you know. So I would rather say that, you know, reaching out to these difficult men is what we do. I would say the entire modules or kind of process of reflection is very highly informed by the 1969 essay of you know, the personal is political. You know, we have translated it in Marathi, we translated it in Hindi, and Carol Henish's paper around personal is political and why men should be talking about personal stuff rather than talking about Delhi and talking about politics. Okay, so I think the pedagogy is very highly informed with feminist pedagogy. I've been trained by Patricia in that kind of pedagogy. I've been trained by WPP in that kind of, and it really worked. And lastly, I would say that, you know, the module offers a lot of space for reflection on personal transformation, because, you know, personal transformation is going to be different for you and different for me, you know, within their socio-cultural context. And I am very thankful to Alan, you know, with whom I worked in P4P, you know, where we really designed this. You know, I was instrumental in designing personal transformation and social transformation sessions. And I think that, you know, it's not just about awareness. It's not just about sensitizing men, because I have a problem with sensitizing men, because men learn the language of equality and they get out of your purview. They learn the language very quickly. You know, that's what my experience is telling. But they might not really transform the power relations. And that's why I think, you know, that's what we do. That's what we basically do, see that, you know, the personal power relations are transformed. It's not just that, you know, men and boys learn the language of equality. Yeah, and that's critical, I guess, and that's critical across the different parts of the world, I guess. You know, they learn the language, they do not transform their relations. Yeah, I'm done.
Thank you. I want to share, because you shared a very personal reflection, I want to share here a comment from a Poe from Lesotho who says, I am a woman who studied peace and security as a fellow because it didn't seem that many women did that. I took a deliberate decision as I was getting frustrated with only men engaging in politics and security issues during Lesotho's political conflict. And so I think why that's relevant is that it also shows when women are championing going into spaces that have been kind of dominated by men, and doing that personal effort, how important it is that men on the other side are doing that personal effort too and going into spaces where they haven't engaged before. And I think, Anand, your experience really shows that, of becoming a kind of a feminist and gender justice activist. I also want to share here from Oswaldo from Nicaragua, who asks, how do we make it appealing for men to have pacifist solutions to political and social conflict when there is a pattern and a history of abuse of power, violence, and injustice coming from those who are holding the power? So how do you make pacifism a possibility or appealing to men? I think in a way that's the question here. And he's sharing that from Nicaragua, where of course the conflict is rising right now, and where the state is repressing people and 47 people have been killed. And maybe that's something, I'm not sure, Ilot, if you are still on the call, but without camera.
I don't think Elot is on.
Okay.
It's slowly joining in.
Okay. Elot, if you can hear us, we know that we cannot see you anymore because this camera was switched off. But if you can hear us, it would be very interesting to hear from you a little bit about those pacifist alternative, basically, and how we can support an engagement in building those. Yes, great.
Yeah.
Were you able to hear the question, Elot?
His Excellency, did you hear?
Not, I was not able.
Okay, so we have a question here from Oswaldo from Nicaragua, who was wondering how we can engage men or make it appealing for men to not enter. I think as you were actually sharing, like you took a decision not to be part of the militarized forces, not to engage in that violence, but to take an alternative route. And how do you think we could, and maybe in your experience, how have you done that to support other men also in taking that alternative route and not being part of the war machine, but to have pacifist solutions? Have you been able to hear?
Yes, I think I had part of the question, but what I think can be done is that for me there is no difference between men from different groups or different classes, because what I have learned is that they do behave the way they were educated. So everywhere I met men trying to work with them, they had quite the same behavior, the same language, the same gestures and so forth. So I think it's really important in all classes and groups, especially when it comes to security forces, for instance, in conflict-affected area. And I remember that I was engaging some officers in our national army, working with them on gender equality, non-violence, and people found it like ridiculous, saying, how can you train or facilitate a non-violence training to military, and yet they are supposed to use violence in whatever they. So what I learned is that people are able to protect the country integrity and and borders, but they are not supposed to use violence in any situation. So it was like the military officers were really interested in learning more about active nonviolence, and some of them are already using these skills and informations in their daily life, and also when interacting with civilians who are not part of the armed forces. So it's really important to look at how we do engage men and boys even before they go to even before they join the military or the police forces or even other life sectors like politics and so forth, because at the end they behave the way they were taught by their parents, the way they were taught in schools and so forth.
Thank you. And Anand, I think you also wanted to respond to that, so please go ahead.
Yeah, I think that there are not going to be global one solutions to come up with the models of different kind of masculinities. As our dear friend Abhijit says, you need to really find out the models of heterodoxies, not the orthodoxies. And then what I think is that there cannot be a global solution of becoming a father. What kind of father? Because it's culturally socially, culturally, politically, situations are completely different. I was invited in Afghanistan to train few men on fatherhood, and I was really worried. How can a father be with AK-47 feeding his child? I mean, that cannot be the solution, right? I mean, I think we need to be very decentralized when we talk about coming up with different models of masculinities, within the caste, class, race, religious context, because those are our realities. We cannot say that, we don't have those kind of realities. So I feel that, the cultural realities need to be really taken, considered when we talk about coming up with all kind of different models of masculinity. And thanks Osvaldo for that, because I I was expecting, if you are around, you would ask that kind of question, basically saying that, because there cannot be one global image of a man. I mean, you cannot. I mean, not even within the length and width of the country like India. I mean, certainly, the Kerala guys are completely different than Kashmiri guys, then Delhi, then UP, and then Maharashtra. I mean, it's completely different. What I feel is that, we need to really decentralize our understanding of manhood and masculinities within the social and cultural realities, and then plan interventions accordingly, rather than defining a single good man. And that's why that's where I have an issue with the framing of term called positive masculinity. What positive could be very subjective to you, and in my culture it could be completely different. I mean, so how do we frame the idea of positive masculinity? I mean, you cannot really globally give up one solution to the entire of the globe, and that's what I feel. So the last word is that we need to have very in-depth understanding socioculturally of the men, of their histories, of their connection with violence, of their connection with militarizations within their own socio-political cultural realities, and then come up with local solutions, not the global ones.
Thank you. Thank you here for raising the concept of contextualization and the importance for not to just copy paste an intervention that works in one space for the sake of upscaling, copy pasting it in a space, but also really working with the people locally and understanding what the local realities are in order to create the interventions. I would like to shift now to you, Cynthia. We have a question here from the audience, I believe from Bilkis Tahira from Pakistan. That there's, the recognition that there are global economic forces behind militarism and the lack of peace and security. And it's a large part of some countries' economy depends on feeding war and conflicts in other countries. And that this is supported by the media, propaganda. How do we make a dent into that? How do we respond? And I think that's also moving now, not just from focusing on the roles of men and boys, but for all of us as feminists for peace. How can we mobilize and make a dent in that military-industrial complex? And I realize that's a very big question, but maybe share the beginning of an answer. And Madeline, I know this is also something that WILPF is very much involved in. So I would like to, after hearing from Cynthia, maybe also quickly hear some reflections from you.
Let me respond quickly to the first two comments from our listeners, which I thought were just great. The woman who said she was going to study peace and security. Of course, it's always called security studies because it was such a masculinized field, and she thought that as a woman, she should intervene in that and gain expertise. And let me just put up a warning flag here. That is that around the world, when women start studying security studies, there is a lot of pressure on them to then become masculinized. I don't mean they change the way they dress, but they change what they take seriously so that they will be taken seriously by the majority of their fellow students and professors who are men. And so that one of the real challenges for a man who's challenging conventional masculinities, and for most women who start to study security studies is that they will be pressured to do everything possible not to be quote unquote feminine. And so that's the way that, in fact, a woman who joins a masculinized field is pressured by most of the men in the field, including her colleagues, to be taken seriously by giving up her original motivations, which may have been for peace. And she will be given rewards, meaning complimented, when she shows that she really can talk about weaponry, as if that is more serious than talking about peace negotiations. That's the first warning, is that women and men who are challenging conventional masculinity, when they join this field called security studies, they will be pressured to give up, shed their unconventional interest in deep security for the sake of being taken seriously in what is too often a very narrow masculinized field called security studies. The second comment I want to have us think more about is the comment from the listener in Nicaragua asking, how can we get, and you picked it up, Yoni, how can we get more men to really see pacifism as a commitment that endorses their sense of a reconfigured manhood. And here I'd just like to put up what has happened in Turkey. There's a very active Turkish conscientious objectors movement, which is part of a pacifist movement. And one of the things that the men who took real risks in declaring themselves conscientious objectors, refusing to join the Turkish military, which is, compulsory conscription. One of the things that they almost slipped into, but women stopped them, they slipped into taking the lead in the pacifist movement, as if a local pacifist movement, a local conscientious objector movement, will only be taken seriously if it's led by men. That's the masculinization of a pacifist movement. You can masculinize, and I know Anand and Ilat and Guy all know this, you can masculinize anything, including a pacifist movement, right? So what the Turkish feminists did is they jumped right in early and said, no, if we're going to have a serious Turkish conscientious objector movement or a serious Turkish pacifist movement, it has to be based on respect of women as serious participants, based on feminist ideas of security and peace, and kind of caught them early on. I'm very admiring of the Turkish feminists for catching these men as they were taking the risk of leading a very risky pacifist movement in Turkey, but they listened to feminists just as they are about to turn the pacifist movement into another patriarchal movement. Now, Yoni, I won't try to engage with your whole big question, but here's the thing we've learned. Any industrial complex, in this case, a militarized industrial complex, is based on, meaning dependent on, and this is the good news, anything that's dependent on ideas about masculinity can be challenged at its root. And most industrial sectors, whether they are mining, finance, or weapons making, depend on masculinized notions of what is taken seriously, what is profit, who gains, who has the intelligence to create that industry's successes. And that's just as true of the military industrial complex. It is threaded through notions of masculinized logic, masculinized profit, masculinized careerism, masculinized networking between men. And it's just more obvious with the weapons producing industry. But it's true of mining and finance and transport as well, and garment making, to tell you the truth, as well. So I think one of the things that feminists and people like Anand and Ilat and Guy who are engaging with feminist thought, one of the things that makes them much more effective in challenging their own military industrial complexes, or in the DRC, weapons purchases, if not weapons manufacturing, is to challenge these notions of logic, rationality, profit, careerism, success. Mm-hmm. And of course, with the military industrial complex, the notion of that this is an industry that is guaranteeing everybody's security. It's not. Now, the other thing, and let me introduce this. Most military industrial production today depends on not only engineering, which is highly masculinized, although there are a lot of women now going into engineering, but it's a highly masculinized field. It not only depends on corporate management, which is highly masculinized, even if there's some women working their way up, but it also depends, now this is contemporary weapons making, it depends on wiring. Wiring that most masculinized managers imagine is best done by you know who, women. Oh, we women, we're so good at wiring. Well, you can't make a jet fighter today. You can't make a highly sophisticated set of night goggles unless you have people in those factories who are the wirers. And those are women. So there are a lot more women now in manufacturing who see them as good jobs. The difference is that the men who are in the weapons manufacturing factories, they get a sense of their own superior manhood by being able to say that they're helping to create an armored vehicle or a jet fighter. That gives them boasting rights at the pub on Friday night. Women don't have boasting rights out of working in a weapons manufacturing factory, but they do have pretty decent pay working in the wiring department. So you really do have to take on feminist understandings of the feminization of wiring as well as the masculinization of weapons making to dismantle the military industry in any country, or the military procurement system in countries like DRC. So Anand's situation in India, where it has a large military industrial complex now, and this would be true in Brazil, there are other countries now that are trying to become the big kids on the block by saying they have a military industrial complex. That's the masculinization of state pride. And then you have other countries like DRC who are mainly procurers, but procurement also is highly gendered because you become an expertise. You can become a, quote, expert, always in quotes, in certain kinds of weaponry, and that builds up your sense of manly superiority.
Thank you.
Thank you. You want me to say something? Because I think what Cynthia said is excellent, because it shows just how we have to deconstruct all of it. And so it's what WILPF has been doing for 103 years, and it takes a long time because we still haven't managed to completely undermine the whole thing so far. But I think what I would like just to add on to what Cynthia is saying is, using that as a platform, we need then to look at how you can actually use what already exists as tools to dismantle it. And I think the work that the WILPF, particularly through the Reaching Critical Goal program and Ray Atchison and all her brilliance with ICANN were able to do in terms of getting a treaty to ban nuclear weapons is an absolute case in point as to the fact that it is possible to actually challenge something which had become almost an accepted part of the military-industrial complex, how they were able to actually engage with individuals in the member states in the General Assembly to work with them to show that both as a matter of international law, common humanity, environmentalism, all of that were being completely undermined by the continued production and potential use of nuclear weapons. And their persistence over all these years has led to this incredible treaty, which no one ever thought would be achievable. Successes like that don't come every day. They have to be hard won, hard fought. Things like the Arms Trade Treaty, again, which WILPF took the lead in terms of trying to get the gender language into the Arms Trade Treaty and trying to get good monitoring involved. And it's the same Guy is not the core, because they're very much engaged in rolling out the reporting requirements for the ATT in Cameroon. It's how you actually try then to use the tools we've got to counter what seems to be the hegemonic power of the military-industrial complex. It's about engaging with the draft convention on transnational corporations, for example, which would have a huge impact on the extractives in DRC, for example, and the impact that has on local communities, and the impact that has on promoting, maintaining militarism and the sorts of masculinities needed to keep the military in positions of power. So it's all connected. So since it's at the big picture, that's how we have to look and frame the discussion. So we're actually looking to see how all the bits fit together. And then we have to we have to organize intelligently is something that we're a framework we came up with from our anniversary, which was how to actually organize using what we've got, using the multilateral system, using international law, using local activism, monitoring, and really put that together to pull each part into a different way of thinking. And one of the, I would say, different way of thinking, reframing the discussions on security would be one of the best ways of undermining the military-industrial complex, as said. Redefining and reframing how we do economic development would be another huge chunk if we could, because militarism now solidly underpinned by neoliberalism, another hugely masculine patriarchal structure of doing business, which is actually has huge gender dimensions and is causing absolute havoc in so many of the countries, particularly acting as a driver of conflict in many regions. We have to deconstruct that. We have to engage with those who are the promoters of neoliberalism. We have to engage with the development banks, the World Bank, the IMF. We have to show how they do actually have responsibilities as well as abilities to go in and to create the sort of havoc that we have seen. So it's this sort of intelligent engagement to try to persuade all the actors in the military-industrial complex to influence policy that I think is going to be the way in which we can then really foment a fundamental change in the way the military-industrial complex works. It's a big job. It's got bigger all the time because the increase in arms production and sale, as we know, is phenomenal. But there is a challenge even in the UK court now about the arms sales to Saudi Arabia. It's all good. It shows that people are paying attention, and the vast majority of people don't like what they see. They don't like seeing British-made weapons being used to kill children in Yemen. They don't like it. That's not what we're about. So I think all of those things have to be underscored, promoted by all of us in all the various fora we can use.
Thank you. I think both Cynthia and Madeline helped us to see the bigger picture and also really see the links there between this concept, this notion of masculinities, and how it feeds, in a way, the bigger systematic problems that we're facing, such as the military-industrial complex, I think the neoliberal system that is exploiting and suppressing people. I want to bring us back for a moment into some of the comments and questions from the listeners or the participants. And I think we've talked quite a bit about the engaging men and boys piece. We went big. I want to go back a little bit also to the women's rights groups and movement and how we can support the work that's being done there as a community. So Yogesh has shared that he wants to raise that two things. Most of the time organizations are engaging boys and men to end gender-based violence and violence against women. So kind of from a very specific mandate. And that it feels sometimes that that's basically using men and boys as instruments towards that purpose. We need to think out of the box and engaging boys and men for justice and peace, and that will lead overall to women's empowerment, voice of and freedom, and a society based on gender equality. And then the second point made is that women's empowerment work has a history of more than 125 years. So there are good and tested strategies, researches, policies, and data and modules. But that the engaging men and boys work is newer. And the point made here is that we don't even have the language of engaging men and boys entirely formulated yet. And there's no term of empowerment for engaging men and boys. And I think that also kind of brings us back to one of the reasons why we wanted to organize this webinar is how can we together develop and articulate and deepen and politicize, I think, the language and the frame that we're using when we're talking about engaging men and boys towards kind of the transformation of that bigger system. And that leads to a question from Manuel, who asked, there is evidence showing the importance of strengthening women's rights organizations to achieve women, peace and security positive outcomes. How can men's organizations and alliances support that kind of work being done? And I think that's a question to Anand and Ilot. On the other hand, there's also a question from Maria, who says, in the spirit of learning, what would the panelists' one ask be for self-reflection for women's organizations today? So I would first like to briefly hear from Anand and Ilot on that question. How can men's alliances, men's organizations, or organizations perhaps working to engage men and boys, support the work that's being done by women's rights organizations concretely? And then and that's the question to Cynthia and Madeline, what can kind of women's organizations, well, what's the one ask on self-reflection based on the conversation so far?
There are a couple of too many questions in sequence, so if go one by one possibly. And the first one that I feel is that men. The first one. How could men's groups? Well, in my context, there are no men's groups as such. Okay, there always been kind of shared spaces with the women's movement in India. I still hesitate to say that there is men's groups in India. Okay, I still feel that men's groups, so-called men's groups, are very highly informed with women's movement and feminist movement in India. So I do not see it as a kind of separate entity. Number one. Number two, I think we're talking about men and women, but very soon we need to really do away with the binaries of men and women and also bring in all kind of gender identities and etc. What I feel is that men not patronizing the issues that women's movement has been raising since decades could be one of the way. So stay as an ally, not to lead the movement. Stay behind, not to lead the movement. I don't see, and I have a very strong objection on so-called men's groups celebrating March the 8th. I seriously have a problem there. I mean that's what I feel. You basically you stand as an ally, not to patronize it, and leave the leadership. Don't lead it. To the extent in some of the states where actually men started gathering in big numbers on March the 8th rather than women, and that's not going to work. What I feel is that men need to really understand that not every single certain space is for you, is not meant for you. And I believe even if they don't do anything, women are capable enough of doing raising their rights and whatever. So you just stay alone. Why don't you think and reflect on your masculinities rather than working on gender-based violence and violence against women? I would say हिंदी में कहते हैं, and I'll translate in English. ऐसे कि आप अपना घर देखो यार, बाहर कहाँ जा रहे हो? You know, which means, you know, why don't you save your own masculine? I mean, you know, you engage with yourself rather than engaging with movements of what women are doing. I mean, and I very strongly believe that, and that's my politics. Thank you.
Thank you, Anand. Pilot.
Yes, I think for us it's quite clear that we didn't come like a new movement or a new ideology that was coming in, but we considered ourselves like people, men and boys who are coming to join women activists to achieve the feminist agenda, and we tried to concept to make it more pragmatic in what we were doing. So what we did was like we joined those campaigns that existed already, that were led by famous women's activists, and as Anand said, I think Cynthia tried to raise the question again that the issue is also how do we masculinize everything? We do masculinize peace building and so forth. We do masculinize examples, not teaching by only talking. And that's why we are saying, like, if you have a project, we have one project that we are running already in Uchuru territory, and we are
Okay, this is very important. We thought we had a solution.
We are a consortium of
Ilot, I think
women's organization, and then we said the women.
Ilot, we're having too many challenges to follow you, which we really regret because we know it's so valuable what you're sharing. In the interest of time, I would then just quickly summarize. Anand, you really mentioned to not talk about men's groups and not think of men's groups in isolation, but always make sure that we bring the work with men and boys together with the women's groups and women's leadership. And I think that's what's generally tend to happen. I think there's very few initiatives that are actually around the world working only with men and boys. I think that's almost a myth that I would like to break. You mentioned the importance of going beyond binaries. I think is very, very important. That men don't need to lead the movement. And I think that's also what Ilot mentioned in the beginning. How can we support and be allies to what women's groups are already doing and organizing, and really be allies and support and put our weight behind that, but not taking up being the key leaders perhaps in those spaces. But I do think it's important for men also to take responsibilities and to, from that point, the starting point of personal reflection as an entry point, taking the responsibility to then do something with those realizations as a person, right? And being an activist, joining the struggles, taking responsibility for the bigger challenges that we're facing in the world. I think to me that's really, really important call on men in a way, and why I'm part of Men Engage Alliance. If we just take a really brief from Cynthia, it would be very nice to hear if you could respond to Maria's question on what are some of the kind of key maybe self-reflections that also women's organizations can take forward based on this conversation that we've had so far.
Well, hi, Maria. Thanks for such a good, challenging question. You're making us think. That's good. I think one of the things around the world with all the groups or activists that I've had the chance to be tutored by, what so many women activists, and particularly feminist activists, are really struggling with today is trying to think about to what extent they are complicit in any kind of local or global racism or local or global ethnocentrism or a class stratification that is particularly based not only on educational inequalities, but rural and urban differences. And that every activist that I've talked to says that that is a major challenge, and it's not always going to look the same. It's not the same in Sri Lanka as it is in the Ukraine, and it's not the same in Ukraine as it is in Canada. It's not the same in Canada as it is in Nicaragua or India. But these stratifications and these arrogances are very deep, and they really limit the scope of genuine alliances, a good term that Anand and Yilov have used. You can't build alliances if mental barriers and societal barriers between people of different ethnic, racial, educational, or rural urban inequalities remain. So I think that's one of the most challenging and urgent bases of reflections. You cannot be inclusive. You cannot therefore be realistic. If you're not inclusive, you're not realistic. If you're not realistically inclusive, you cannot do the work of creating peace and dismantling militarism. It's impossible. So one has to both be reflective about one's own complicity in those various arrogances. But here's the challenge, I think. One's got to be reflective without just being self-centered. And this is true, I'm sure, for all the men engaged workers as well. It is really tough to both be seriously self-reflective and yet not turn inward and find oneself the most interesting person on the planet. And so one has to be both self-reflective and outward engaged simultaneously.
That was a totally brilliant answer. So what can I add to that? Nothing very much. I think basically what you've just said is exactly what we need to be doing, because in effect it's saying that we turn your feminist curiosity on ourselves and our relations externally. And how do we do that so that we better understand why it is that we should be engaging with men to tackle patriarchy, and then we engage with what it is to explore the whole gender dimensions of masculinities, femininities, what it means in terms of sexualities and identities. So we really are embracing the whole in rem, the human condition, because if we don't do that, then we're not feminists. And I think that what you said in terms of needing to be able to do the two things at the same time is a challenge, but that's what makes it interesting, to say the least. You never get bored doing this job.
Thank you. A very complex task at hand, but also not a boring one because of that. And I would say an opportunity for all of us to improve our relationships, our experiences in life. I know, Anand, you want to reflect, but I do want to just thank everybody now for the moment, for the conversation we've had. It was not so easy with the technical challenges and pulling some of the questions and comments from the group, but we hope we've done reasonably well so far. I want to hand it over to Lakshman for one of the nearly final parts of the webinar.
Yeah, thank you again. I mean, this is really amazing. I think that whatever we were discussing also boils down to the diversity we have today at the webinar present with us. So I think what we want to do for the next probably 15-20 minutes is to open the floor for any reflections among the participants of the webinar, and feel free to reflect on particularly on two things. One is something that really inspired you after hearing to this amazing panelists and the experiences being shared and the discussions afterwards. What really has inspired you, out of this discussion? or anything that is a concern for you as well while we keep on discussing. So the feel free to use your screen to raise your hands. After your name, there is a button with hand like this. If you click on it, it will raise your hand, and we'll notice that, and someone from the facilitators will open it for you. While doing that, we also recognize we may not be able to give space to everyone. So continue sharing your comments and answers to this point also on the chat box and the question. So continue doing that. So that we can. So two things. One, again, what inspired you from the discussions and the discourses, and what are any concerns, or also if there are any disagreements to what has been said by. So we'll open the floor now. So I can see Bilkis. Yes, Bilkis, go ahead.
The grassroots work that both Anand and Ilot are doing, in terms of self-reflection, discussion, and then how it's then taken forward in terms of, action in the larger society, but also the, academic discussion and the points made by Cynthia and Madeline both. That was, a lot of questions. Again, it raised many, many, many more questions. But I think what really for me in our work here, in working with university students and the community people, is how do we then, during the discussions, what really comes up is that the economic situation in the country, the levels of poverty, men have to be men to earn, okay? And if in their workplaces they don't behave like a masculine person, it has a very it can have a negative impact on their career as well, particularly in the military. When we talk to the military men and the policemen, and we have done some trainings with the policemen as well. Not really with the military men. They wouldn't let us put our foot into the Ministry of Defense. They were very kind and gave us tea and snacks, but nothing doing with the training. They also feel bound by the masculine role model that they are given, in which they have to perform. So we keep looking for alternatives, and so far we have had a number of individual successes with people, but so far there's no solution and I would talk of Pakistan, at the level of Pakistan, to see how we manage this within the regional threats, within the political situation with Afghanistan, Iran, India, others. How do we even talk about, although we do talk about limiting military budget and, reducing military expenditures, etc., etc., coupled with the threats that poses to human rights defenders. So, these are huge questions that we keep grappling with and have really so far not many answers.
Thank you, Bilkis. Who's that? Osvaldo, you want to talk as well? Okay. Yes.
Yes, thank you. Just trying to respond to the question that you posed, Laxman. I felt inspired by Anand and Ailot testimonies on how their involvement with feminist teaching, feminist analysis around peace, security, war have deeply informed their own work, their views, and their activism. I think that's because also that resonates with me in how we women can be really benefited from the historical struggle and analysis and proposal from feminism. And also, I feel very inspired by Cynthia's call to all of us to do simultaneous work, internal and external, to do our self-reflective work, and at the same time to engage as activists out there, trying to transform practices, structures that are out there. I think these two work hand in hand. You cannot do one well without the other. So thank you, Cynthia, for reminding us that. And thank you all for the great webinar. Very, very informative. And it made me think that we need to study and learn more and engage in more conversation about this situation that is affecting so many countries right now in the world.
Right, thank you, Osvaldo. And we know we have friends, colleagues associated with WILPF as well, so feel free to come in to share your reflections as well. As I'm still waiting, and if there is any technical challenges to raising your hand, please feel free to send in a chat message or a question as well. And also taking this as also an opportunity to share my own reflections as well. While I wait to see a few hands coming up, is I think it's so inspiring to hear, and I think the challenge that we have at the moment with regards to engaging boys and men field is what Cynthia you mentioned is what does it mean for engaging boys and men per se, and how we understand as boys and men becoming an ally, and this meaning of ally varies quite a lot, and many of us feel that we are being ally, but at the same time we sort of forget about that we are sort of dominating or we are becoming dominant in the field. While we are trying to dismantle the same system, we are sort of toppling off on the system and trying to sort of project ourselves as the activists men, so that we get celebrated because of the work we do. And I think the general tendency with Anand, I do share your concerns as well. And I come from a perspective that, for boys and men, I don't think we need to be afraid of being essentialized in the work we do. It's more about being conscious of our roles and responsibilities and be mindful that it is patriarchy and patriarchal institutions where we, by virtue of being male, sort of enjoy certain privileges and power. And how do we bring those reflections into the work we do also and define our own role as ally within that space? So I think it's, and then how do we understand peace and who defines it? Whether what M4 was talking about in this situation where peace is currently being defined by military, feel that's the definition it should be, and we sort of make it more complex by bringing our own so-called patriotism or nationalism and say that we are more and the way peace needs to be defined is in a particular manner. So I think we need more space whereby we can listen to the alternative definitions of what do we understand and how do we understand by what do we mean by peace. Is it just the absence of violence or is it something more?
True.
And I like this saying called, just an absence of violence doesn't mean it's a peace. And how do we make that very clear in the work we do and bring it from always not look at men and women or people of gender diversity as an actors, but as a collective actors who need to come together to be defined. I can see Izare. Please go ahead. Let me unmute you so that you can speak up as well. Yeah, Izare, go ahead.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
Yes. We can't hear you for some reason. I can see you are trying to speak, but we can't hear you. So if you don't mind, if you can type your points in the screen and I can read it for you. So, how to engage women in peace and security process in African countries? So that's a question. Thank you, Vijay.
What is the
My sense here, many women in Africa are involved in peace building. I think, for example, there are very active WILPF branches in some of the African countries, actually.
Yeah.
So maybe if that's not yet connected with or not visible to the work you're doing, about having a good look and trying to find and connect and see how that work can be supported.
In fact, one of the wonderful teaching, in any kind of group, films that I've ever seen is called "Pray the Devil Back to Hell," right? Which is a Liberian saying, and maybe this audience member would like to show it to his or her group, or even just any community group. Pray the devil back to hell. I think for a community group, you can get it for free. And it's about the Liberian women who came together at great risk to challenge the warlords in the civil war in Liberia, and how long it took them. They had to overcome barriers between Christian women and Muslim women. They had to overcome barriers between women who've become refugees and women who were still in their homes. It wasn't an easy movement to create, and all the time they were faced with masculinized, militarized intimidation, and yet they did it. It doesn't mean that Liberia is paradise, but it means that it's a very good example of African women creating one of the most effective war-ending women-led peace groups that any of us are familiar with in the last 20 or 30 years. So the documentary film called Pray the Devil Back to Hell about the Liberian women's peace movement is a wonderful thing to show, a wonderful film to show to any collective group.
Yeah, in fact, Lima got Nobel for that. Yeah,
yes, that's right, Rebecca Bowie.
Yeah,
and she always gives credit to all the women. She became the spokesperson, but she always gives credit to all the women. Most of them women of very, very humble means who took risks to challenge the warlords in Liberia that were creating this culture of violence.
And interestingly supported by the men who saved up money to pay for them to go. They said the taxi drivers and the others who wouldn't do it themselves, couldn't do it themselves because it was a female-led, it had to be a women's movement. But they gave that sort of support.
Yeah, there's being an ally.
Yeah, there's being an ally. Do what you can. We all have to do our bit.
Right.
And then don't go and present yourself as the one who should get the Nobel Prize.
Great, thank you. So we have David from Australia. Yeah, Anand, I'll come back to you. David from Australia wants to come in. David.
Laxman, thanks for a really, really intriguing presentation, everyone. I had kind of a comment and a question here, which is that for a lot of the complexity, and I really appreciated the comments that you had, Anand, there around the multiplicity of masculinities that operate in militarism. But one thing that I felt that might be missing a bit, and I'd love to hear people's comments on, is the way in which masculinities that don't outwardly appear to be the most violent support, rely on, and benefit from militarism in incredibly harmful ways. I see this in the Australian context all the time, with how politicians who themselves don't necessarily engage in direct violence but still rely on those institutions and get a great deal of status by claiming that they're pro-feminist actors in certain spaces, and then the next day turning around to do arms deals. And just thinking about how, some of your thoughts about how can we engage in this agenda in a way that doesn't risk rewarding men simply because they appear respectable and less violent than the worst example we can think of.
Right. So anyone to take this point on, feel free to jump in as well.
I think it's very linked to the question that we were looking at earlier, and how do you actually undermine the military or break the military-industrial complex? And I think it's a similar sort of approach, isn't it, really? It is to expose the structures which enable and facilitate men like that to be able to play that double-edged game, to claim entitlement under both, if you like. And I think that's part of the problem, because what we are talking about is structures of power which, in a political economy, which does favour a particular type of security, giving it status over and above everything else, which is then highly masculinized, which then feeds into the perpetuation of that system. And the way we break it is by identifying the fault lines, so that it is not possible to stand for peace and wanting to have an end to arms trading and everything else, or calling yourself a feminist foreign policy, the Swedish model, if you like, and then turn around and do the arms deals. You can't do that. So it's exposing the hypocrisy of both and demanding consistency, at the same time constantly analysing and reframing what it is that security is, how it actually creates and multiplies and drives issues of war and peace, and how we need to dismantle it in order to be able to have some real possibility of the fundamental change which we obviously need, not least in terms of the environmental destruction, which we haven't even had time to think about in the terms of this conversation. That's not an answer, but it is, I think, a process which has to be engaged in order to be able to do that. And I would refer back to what we were saying about the military-industrial complex.
And I think Anand and Ilan have underscored what Madeline just said by saying there are multiplicity of masculinities, and oftentimes it's the elite men who present themselves as, quote, rational and disciplined, who then depend for their status on portraying, oh, it's the rank and file men who are out of control. It's the rank and file men who commit rape. It's the rank and file men who fire off their guns indiscriminately. But we masculine elite men, we're the men who control violence. We are disciplined in our militarized security scheming. And so I think oftentimes, David, your example in Australia, and you can match it in many other countries, where the elite men who make the arms deals don't seem like the out of control rank and file wayward masculinized men, but they're just as militarized and just as patriarchal, but they depend on all of us imagining it's rank and file men who create havoc. And it's the elite, rational men, deeply militarized, who gain status because they're not the out of control rank and file men. So elite men play the masculine hierarchy game all the time for the sake of their own status, and a lot of us buy it. Oh, thank goodness, at least he seems in control and he knows how to knot his tie.
Yeah.
I just want to share a concrete example because how difficult this sometimes is. We still have to find our ways to challenge those who are part of the military system, for example. And in our case, Sweden, the government of Sweden, that is incredibly important for gender justice work all around the world and supporting that, including to Men Engage Alliance. We also take the opportunities when we have it to also challenge them and call them out on the fact that military spending is quite an important part of their economic model. And even though they have a feminist foreign policy, I still think that sometimes the integration of that feminist foreign policy in absolutely everything they do internationally is not aligned. And I think it's sometimes for us also to take responsibilities and a little bit of risk on very concrete moments to do call them out on that, even though they are our supporters. And that's sometimes very difficult, but I know that WILPF has also taken actions to do that. And I think we have to keep walking that fine line, but we have to do it.
We are slightly over time now. I know.
Last word, Lakshman. I really want to say that because I have a feeling. I mean, I have a feeling for the kind of need for advocacy within peace and security sector. How about Men Engage and WILPF proposing a resolution around engaging with men and boys and masculinities within the UN Security Council resolutions system? Thank you.
Great. I think with that, that really leads to the next step we have here. So we do, as we said in the beginning, it is just the beginning, and Madeline said it very clearly. Is it just the beginning and start of the conversation? And this is one step. So, but we want to continue walking down the line and make it more stronger, partnership as we move forward in terms of the common agenda. So we'd like to take a minute or so to take a moment to reflect on from your point of view, what should be the next step for us, for WILPF, for Men Engage, and for yourself as activists and experts. What should be the next step for us coming out from here? And you will receive a little survey in the screen somewhere where you need to, so we'll really request you to fill that out so that we can really get a sense of what you feel about the next step should be for all of us to take forward. At the same time, we continue, putting together a report of this conversation, and we'll be sharing with you all as well. And we are really committed, just to reiterate that we are committed to continue this conversation, even though it might be a difficult conversation as we move on. So it will pop up in your screens, and you will have to have time for 2 minutes to fill it out. So make sure you fill it out. And while we wait for that, just as a concluding remarks on that, and where we as Men Engage stand in terms of the next step for us as well, and where we stand in terms of principally where we stand on the agenda of women, peace, and security. So now probably we should say peace and security rather than women, peace, and security, as Cynthia was mentioning. So I think for us, where we come from is that whatever we do, the work with boys and men have to be women and girls centered. And we can't just consider engaging boys and men without necessarily looking at the relationships and that Cynthia was mentioning about. And not only talk about being an ally, but also a meaningful ally. And that also means, so there is a noise coming from somewhere. So this also means that in whatever we do, we need to make sure that women and girls and activists are part of every conversation and decisions we make as anything we want to do together in this effort. There is some background noise. Okay, anyway, I'll continue. And then also one thing which we are very clear is the work with boys and men is actually this is good. Yeah, okay. So it is actually not about men's rights or men's vulnerabilities or men protecting women. It is rather to advance women's rights to autonomy and feminist agenda at the core of what we do as an alliance. So this is what our mission statement is all about, and we really mean this. And this means our initiative needs to have a strong gender power analysis embedded in everything we do. So that's something as guided by the mission statement, and also all of our interventions actively prevent to reinforce male dominance and unequal power relationship, because we have seen it has happened by saying, oh, engaging boys and men, there is an increasing interest on this work. And one of the key questions I keep on reflecting, and Union I keep on debating about it, is it because those men who are in the decision-making table are men, and then suddenly they are hearing the word men and boys is why it is being more attractive? Or do they really understand the politics behind it, right? So I think for us, it's important that we understand the politics behind it, what we are doing. So I think we do not reinforce again male dominance, male power by the work we are doing, but then take this as an opportunity to do a critical examination of how the patriarchal institutions and operations operate vis-a-vis the understanding of masculinity. And another key concern for us is to consider that and be clear that engaging boys and men is not a goal in itself. It is a means to something, and for us, it is to means to transform unequal power relationships and dismantle patriarchy. And this is where we come from as well. And while we work with boys and men, we have to go beyond, and that also comes back to the point someone was raising earlier, is that it's not about just engaging boys and men. So it is together with women's and people with other gender identities to dismantle certain systems that are reinforcing inequalities and patriarchal systems. And then when we say gender transformative approach, that is not equal to engaging boys and men. So work with women and girls can be more equal, if not equal, be transformative when it comes to dismantling patriarchy. So there is this gender tendency which we have started seeing, is that when somebody says gender transformative approach, or then follows by engaging boys and men. So that's not how we understand the gender transformative approach. So we need to understand that those are two different, and engaging boys and men is one part of the larger gender transformative approaches out there. And lastly, is very strongly, which you already mentioned, is engaging boys and men should not be, sort of an obligation from any donors or UN agencies. Gender justice issue. And whenever we get use our voice against those practices and hold them to account as much as we can. And then I would request Madeline to come in as well for the closing remarks.
Well, I think you've summed it up brilliantly. My little dog was obviously shouting applause.
Yeah, that's
my chair here. I think for me this has been a really, really interesting webinar, and it's been great to hear from practitioners and activists who are actually doing the work on the ground, because I think that's something we miss so often, is to actually hear what it means in real life when we're trying to do this work. And as we said at the beginning, it's a long road. It's not going to be that easy. We do have our own trust issues, which we all have to overcome. And I think what Cynthia said about our need to really reflect and think about how and in what way we have become products of patriarchy ourselves, how we take that forward in our activism, is absolutely pertinent to everything that we are trying to do together. It's the old feminist and I think fabulous slogan, deeds not words, is what we need to move into. We need to actually work together to obtain results. And those deeds will be what it is that ends up dismantling patriarchy, building on everything you have set out in the Men Engage manifesto, if you like, for going forward. And it's everything that I think that feminists will want to embrace, because when you think of it, we all have a common goal, and that is to obtain peace through finding real equality, so that we're ending the different oppressions that people suffer as a result of an unjust system. And that's all of us working together to achieve that. These are good steps in that direction. So I'm looking forward to moving forward with all of you.
So thank you again. Thank you all for joining today. And as I mentioned, you will see a small survey popping up as towards the end of the webinar, and you'll have 2 minutes to fill that out. And we do humbly request you to fill that out before we close out the screen. And that will help us in the next step, all of us together. And thank you for all your time staying 15 more minutes out of the long 2-hour webinar. And we really look forward to working closely with you all, wherever you are, as much as possible for our common agenda. And thank you all, and thank you to the panelists as well for amazing reflections, questions, and discussions.
Thanks, everybody.
Great job.
Thanks. Ciao.
Thanks.
So I'm waiting for the popping up questionnaire.
Then request Maria's support here on how to do that.
You have to exit the webinar in order for this questionnaire to pop up.
Perfect.
Hello.